She thumps a cane and drinks champagne. She's formidable and judgmental, but we can guarantee that she's a quintessential Lady D, who recognizes great potential. What would Danbury do?
Welcome to What Would Danbury Do, a podcast about the Bridgerton series from A to V. Bonus episodes are back, babies. And to kick things off, we're looking at romance novel Serialization. We all knew that the Duke of Hastings wouldn't return for season 2, but it got us thinking about the specific way romance novels handle series, and what that can look like for adaptations. Scholar, lecturer, young adult author, and our friend, Dr Jodi McAlister, sat down with Kate for this bite-sized lesson. Don't forget, you can find us on Twitter and Facebook as @BridgertonPod and Instagram as WWDDPod. And join the conversation using the hashtag WWDDPod.
So, Jodi, can we go back to the books themselves and talk a little bit about the way that romance novels work in terms of serializations when we're looking at multi-book series?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a couple of different ways in which serialization works. The first is where you follow the same set of characters across multiple books. So some famous examples of this, we've got Outlander with Jamie and Claire. We've got 50 Shades of Grey, favorite, quotation marks, scare quotes, with Anna and Christian. And this happens quite a lot in erotic romance, actually. And then we've got really long-running series like Indepth, Nora Roberts as JD Robb with Even Rourke. So in these, we're following the same couple who presumably a few books in or a little while in get together and stay together. And then we usually have something else kind of driving the plot after that. So all kinds of historical shenanigans in Outlander. They're always solving mysteries in Indepth. And 50 Shades, you've got that erotic romance thing, but also a suspense plot gets introduced. And this happens in a lot of erotic romance series where the couple gets together. They're like, oh no, what do we do to keep the plot going? Let's introduce some suspense. But the more common variety of serialization, particularly in more modern romance, is where you've got a series of books set in the same universe, but with a different couple in each book. And there'll be some linking factor between all the couples. So it could be a group of friends, it could be some kind of sports team, or very, very commonly, as we have in Bridgerton, we have a family. So each book features its own Bridgerton sibling. And this is actually recent in the romance genre. So the Belgian romance scholar Anne Goris wrote an article about serialization and romance where she looked at Rita winners, noting that there are problems using Rita winners as a corpus, but just asterisk that. But in the 80s, maybe like one of the books was in a series. And by 2012, 2013, when she was looking at this, nearly all of them were. So serialization is now quite ubiquitous in the romance genre.
So if we look at the way that serialization has changed from, as you say, from the 80s, which sadly is 40 years ago, to now, when Julia Quinn released The Duke and I, it was actually starting to become a little bit more common that shared universe idea existed. It had become really popular, I think, in the 90s in paranormal romances, but also I think in the contemporary romances as well, because we had paranormal romances where they'd be part of a vampire family or a werewolf pack, for example, and each book would have a couple. But we also sort of saw the books like Suzanne Brockman's series where it was a Navy SEAL. I don't actually know what a Navy SEAL group is called. What's the
squad?
What's maybe? The collective noun for Navy SEAls?
I'm going to say squad.
Anyway, so we had Navy SEAL squad, and each of the Navy SEALs eventually got their own romance as well. What were we looking at for historical romance at the time?
Yeah, so I do not want to suggest that Julia Quinn invented this. I do not think she is a trailblazer in this sense. So at the same time, we have authors like Stephanie Lawrence writing with the Sinster series, doing much the same thing. So the Bridgertons aren't new, even in 2000 when they first came around. This, like, Lisa Kleypas is doing stuff around this time as well. Like, this was a thing that people were doing. It just wasn't quite as common as it is now, where just about everything is in a series, really.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about how romance serialization differs from other genre fictions. Fantasy and crime, for example, are very, very common to have either an overarching series, like you might think about A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. R. Martin, or Patricia Cornwell, for example, that follows one detective. So those are stories that tend to be much more strongly linked either through character or through world than romance serializations. Why do you think that romance serializations work this way as opposed to the way that their genre cousins work?
Well, I think this is the central argument of the article that you and I wrote, Kate, which is it's all about the promise of the ending. So fantasy, for instance, is a genre that is defined more by mood and more by vibe and arguably even more by setting, though that's a bit contentious, than it is by plot. There are common plots that we see in fantasy, like quests and stuff. That was really scholarly. Stuff. But they're not mandatory. In romance, we do have like two really key mandatory elements in that there has to be a romance A plot. It can't just be like a B plot or a C plot. It has to be the A plot, and it has to end happily, and that ending is vital. Now, another genre which is largely defined by ending is crime, but of course you can have the same detective go on to solve multiple mysteries. Like, that is just the nature of the beast there. In romance, you can't have a happy ending, particularly where the promise of that ending is happily ever after, and then be like, oh, let's go on to another book and do another happily ever after, because then you have to send your couple through this like next agonizing torture for them to make that next happy ending worthwhile. So you would constantly be undoing the ending to repeat the ending, which is really just not that pleasurable for the audience, I think, which is why having the couples, a different couple in each book, and they get their happy ending, and then we get glimpses of them afterwards in what Goris, who I mentioned before, calls the post-HEA space. I think there's something really pleasurable in that, in us just getting a little glimpse of how they're doing and being like, they're good, they're fine, they're having a really nice time.
So if that's the case where it is, I'm going to put this in caveats as not always necessary, but like mostly necessary that we have one couple or one happy ever after per book. What do you think is the reason to have series at all then, if we're going to be looking at a different couple every time?
I think part of this is the ongoing investment in characters. We've been trained from reading other genres to want to see people over a long period of time. So in Bridgerton, for instance, we get our first glimpse of Hyacinth as a little girl in The Duke and I, and by the time we get to her book, It's in His Kiss, or season 7 of Bridgerton, or wherever we end up, we're so invested in her because we've learned about her through the background. So it's a way to create investment in a book before you've even begun, which is nice. But part of it is also that the pleasure of getting a glimpse of those characters after they've had their happy ending in that post-HEA space, to know for sure that their ending was happy and that like everything has turned out all right for them, really, truly.
Just before we start talking about Bridgerton itself, let's just tangent back really quickly to those series that you used as examples prior that didn't do it as one couple per book, but actually have an ongoing arc with an ongoing couple. How do those stories work within their space?
Yeah, so I think what we have in these books are some kind of hybridized genres, which is why this mode of serialization where we follow just the one couple makes sense. So if we look at Outlander, for instance, which Diana Gabaldon has repeatedly argued is not romance, I do not believe her, and I've in fact written an academic book chapter to this effect. But if we agree with me and we say that Outlander is romance, it is so strongly hybridized, not just with historical romance, but with other forms of historical fiction. And we could also argue that she does introduce another character, another couple, like later in the book series with Brianna and what's her husband's name? Roger. But it's more of a saga, I think. That while that central like love story between Jamie and Claire is kind of the engine of the plot, she really does kind of recreate some of those dark moments, those points of ritual death in the terms of Pamela Regis as the book series go through. Like at one point, sorry, spoilers for Outlander, Claire and Jamie are separated for 20 years. Yeah. There's another bit where she thinks Jamie is dead and she marries someone else. Like all kinds of shenanigans happening there. So you kind of get to go through the beats of the romance again and again, but also you are hybridized very much with that kind of historical fiction as opposed to historical romance sort of saga style genre.
It helps when you have time travel in your back pocket to just drop in now and again to separate your characters and give them whole different stories apart from each other. And when it comes to the Indepth series with Eva and Rourke, do you want to talk about that really fast?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is essentially, it's futuristic for one, so you've got that, but it's also fundamentally a mystery series that's got a romantic backbone to it. So you can serialize it because even while the relationship between Eve and Rourke is very much central to those books, it's not always driving the plot. What's driving the plot is whatever mystery that Eve, who is a future police person, whatever mystery she's solving in that installment, and Rourke is there in the background, and their relationship is central, but it's not necessarily the engine of the plot, even in the way that it was in the earlier books when they weren't together. And they get together quite early. I think they get married between like books 3 and 4 or something, and there's like 50.
I think for that one series in particular, their romance novels up until about book 4, and then they become police procedurals with a really strong romantic, B plot, C plot, depending on what else is happening in that book. And when it comes to things like 50 Shades of Grey and other examples of those erotic trilogies, they normally come in trilogies, so they do have an ending already built into the story. It's just that the story tends to be a little bit bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in erotic romance, what you can do is that you can really kind of expand them out by adding more sex scenes, for one. But also, once, I think I mentioned this earlier, once the couple get together, so often a suspense element gets introduced. So you see this in 50 Shades of Grey with Anna's like evil boss or whatever. You see this in Sylvia Day's Crossfire series. You see this in like Lisa Renee Jones. So many different erotic romance series have a suspense plot that's been folded in. So, if we return to 50 Shades of Grey, the central work of the romance in those books is done 1/4 of the way into the second book of the trilogy. The rest is all suspense plot with a bunch of sex scenes, which is why you can follow the one couple in that way. And I think this is why this mode of serialization doesn't work for what we might think of as romance proper, as opposed to romance really hybridized with something else, is that romance is a genre that wants to come to an ending.
So let's take a look at Bridgerton as a TV adaptation of the series. So people who are not familiar with the way that romance novel series work, have been a little bit surprised at how little we see of Daphne and Simon in series 2 and the shift from Anthony to Kate. So, will you expect that this will continue to happen?
I hope so, honestly. But this is kind of the first time this sort of romance has really been done on TV. So even if we look at the other romance properties that Netflix has adapted, so the most obvious example here is Virgin River, but we could also talk about Sweet Magnolias. They're really, even though those series were written in this one couple per book way, that is not the way that they've been brought to television. Like in Virgin River, for instance, the first book is about Jack and Mel, and then the second book is about Preacher and Paige, and we're 3 series into Virgin River, and it's still all about Jack and Mel, and we haven't seen Paige for like a season and a half.
I would really like to see Paige again. I am really invested in Preacher and Paige.
Yeah, 100%. Me too. And the heroine of the third book is now hooked up with the villain instead of the hero from the book. So I think they're taking some strong directions in terms of serialization. Like they're really invested in that first couple. And Bridgerton could have gone down that route. They could have been like, okay, let's center Daphne and Simon and then let's do other stuff around them. But I'm really glad they didn't. I think this is a really, really interesting change for television. When there was the kind of story came out that season 2 has just broken season 1's record for like most watched English language series ever, I was like, this works then. because you can watch season 2 without having watched season 1, in the way that you can pick up a romance novel in the middle of a series and still know what's going on, even if you don't have that ongoing investment with all the characters, which opens up kind of different modes of reading. I think this opens up different modes of watching. And for Netflix, I think it might also be kind of good for them algorithmically, because it will promote rewatching. Like someone that came in at season 2 will be like, oh, I liked that. I'll go back and watch season 1. Oh, look, oh dear, I'm watching season 2 again. And you can have that happen in every season going forward. Now, will they stick with the 1 couple per season rule? I suspect it might get a little bit blurry particularly if they stick with the time frame of the books. You've got Benedict and Francesca's first marriage happening vaguely at the same time, and then Colin and Penelope and Eloise and Phillip all happening at sort of the same time. And they haven't really set up Benedict for his romance at all, so will we be going to Colin and Penelope / Eloise and Phillip, or just Penelope and Eloise next? Hashtag Peneloise. I don't know, but I think they would be quite smart to stick with the 1 couple per season book, because they're pioneering a new way of viewing, which could open the door for more romance novel adaptations. And what Bridgerton has shown is people want them.
Well, I think it's interesting as well, because when you think about the way that they adapted Virgin River, they adapted Virgin River for television as you would expect a television story to be told. And that's what we're seeing with the 3 seasons with Jack and Mel, and stretching it out a little bit and changing some of the backstories and the B plots to provide extra story to help sort of puff out that A plot line. But when we're looking at the way that Bridgerton is being adapted, it is being adapted for television, obviously, and there have been major changes made to the series to make it more visual, and to work with the one of the major things I think that romance novels adaptations struggle with is so much that happens in a book is in deep point of view, and you can't really show on television somebody thinking or feeling really deeply. It has to be said or acted upon in order to get it outside of somebody's head and into the world. And so obviously we've seen some changes in that regard, but realistically, I think what we're seeing with the Bridgerton adaptation is we're seeing that romance novel serialization where every story is new. It's in a world that we're familiar and comfortable with already, but it's like a new television show every single time. So I think when you said that there's a lot of watchability and rewatchability, I think that's one of the secrets to why it's working so well, because you're not going to get that series fatigue that you would get in other stories. You're not necessarily going to get that, like the will they, won't they tension is great until it's not great anymore. And when you're focusing on a different couple, the will they, won't they can't last more than, what is it? Is it 8 episodes? Can't last more than 8 episodes before we move on. So I think that it's quite a smart way of doing television, and a way that suits the binge kind of style of watching that we're doing at the moment.
Like, absolutely. It's really hard to do slow burn in a binge watch culture. And I think Bridgerton season 2, kind of, considering they only had 8 episodes, did slow burn like beautifully. And it also shows how much depends on your actors. Like, the point you made about interiority is like dead on, but we got so much out of Jonathan Bailey. You could tell what he was thinking here, and just how consumed by his emotions he was at all time. So I would kind of like this to see this be a skill set that actors work to develop, the ability to convey that level of, oh, I'm feeling so many feelings all at once without saying a word. Because it's one of the benefits of screen as well, is that you can communicate so much in so few moments if you're working kind of with the right actors.
Jonathan Bailey understood the assignment so well in this season with the eyes, just the eyes and the pining that he managed to do. That was some next level adaptation, Jonathan Bailey. We are very impressed.
Yeah. And also, can we shout out to Simone Ashley here, who also understood the assignment. Like, these were 2 people who I really believed were hot for each other, which I'm not sure I 100% bought in the first season, at least not to the same extent. Yeah. Like, I can see why season 2 is, I think, broadly speaking, getting better reviews than season 1. I mean, also season 1 had added problematic elements, and I know you have talked in depth about the scene on your podcast, a problem which season 2 does not have. But I think as kind of a romance adaptation where you need to believe in the relationship, season 2 is a stronger example.
Daphne obviously appears in season 2. She's happily married and has her little baby that she brings along to family gatherings. But she's there as almost a mentor figure for Anthony, somebody who has gone through what it is that he is going through and can offer some advice from the other side. Whether or not Anthony decides to follow that advice, well, that's part of the story.
Yeah. And I think they very much already knew that they weren't going to have Regé-Jean Page back, or they had made a very, very firm decision about the kind of serialization they were going to do by the end of season 1, because they completely closed off that Simon and Daphne narrative. I remember when I was watching it thinking, if you want to have a story for Simon and Daphne in season 2, it needs to be a story that's kind of the inverse of the one here. It needs to be about them, like, it needs to be an infertility story almost. It needs to be about them, like, struggling to get pregnant. But then when she has that baby at the end of season 1 and there's like, oh, it's a baby log out of nowhere. Not out of nowhere. It was very expected. But yeah, it was like, well, there really is nowhere left for this story to go in season 2. So there's a famous scholar of romance, Denis de Rougemont, Love in the Western World from 1945. The first line of this book is, happy love has no history, which means we only hear stories about like love gone wrong, or like destructive love almost, because when two people are together and they're happy, that is just fundamentally not that interesting, really. Which is why we have to finish books that they're happily ever after, because you can't have a whole book that's just like, here we are, being happy. Isn't it cool? Isn't it fun? And yeah, they really closed off all potential avenues for conflict in that Simon and Daphne story, which I'm sure is very pleasant for them in their lives, but would not make good narrative.
That's it. Happy stories are not compelling stories necessarily when it comes to driving a narrative forward.
Yeah, the image that Denis de Rougemont uses is, the myth of Tristan and Isolde, of them sleeping with a sword between them, which they habitually do because they are very goth, I guess. But he's like, look, they seek out that sword. As soon as you take that sword out, that barrier between them, because she's like married to King Mark or whoever, and he's got all his stuff that he's doing, whatever. As soon as you take that barrier out, there's no more story. They seek out the sword between them. And he argues that love stories seek out obstacles, because without the lovers seeking to overcome something, you've got no more story. Which is why, like, the point of ritual death in a romance novel is them finding the biggest obstacle. And then once they've overcome that, you have to end the story because there's nowhere left to go. There are no more obstacles left.
All right. So Simon and Daphne and Kate and Anthony have overcome their obstacles. Without holding you accountable on any level whatsoever, what do you think is going to happen in season 3?
I mean, there's what I think will happen versus what I want to happen.
Tell us both.
What I think will happen is we'll get a fairly straight adaptation of Romancing Mr Bridgerton. So I think we'll get Penelope and Colin. I think we'll get very much that story. And I think either the Eloise story at the same time or a lot of setup for it. I think they definitely brought back Marina and Phillip in this season to just really remind you that they existed, because obviously poor Marina is not long for this world. I don't think we'll get Benedict, which I have mixed feelings about, because I feel much as the good ladies of What Would Danbury do about Benedict's book, which is that he's just very tall. Though, of course, Show Benedict is a whole different creature. It is possible we could get Benedict's book, but I think it needs to be Henry. Benedict needs a boyfriend. And I'll be quite disappointed, I think, if they, a straight adaptation of Romancing Mr Bridgerton. I'm like, yeah, cool, clearly Penelope and Colin, we've set this up. Bye Benedict is real. Let Benedict kiss a boy. That's what I want to see in season 3.
That's all for this bonus episode of What Would Danbury Do? make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, because we will be releasing bonus episodes throughout the season. And of course, we'll be back soon with Bridgerton Episode 2, Off to the Races. In the meantime, you can find Dr Jodi McAlister tweeting about pop culture, romance, and academic stuff on @JodiMcA. That's JODIMCA. Or check out her books. She writes both kinds, academic and fiction. As always, you can find us on Twitter and Facebook as @BridgertonPod and Instagram as WWDDPod. Or send us an email at bridgertonpod@gmail.com. Personally, I'd love to know what your favourite romance series are. Do you like to follow the same relationship across multiple books, or are you normal? This episode was recorded on the traditional and unceded land of the Wurundjeri, Bunurong and Gadigal peoples, and edited by me, Rudy Bremer, on Gadigal country. Thanks for listening, and remember, WWDD. What Would Danbury Do is part of the Frolic Podcast Network. Find more podcasts you'll love at frolic.media/podcasts.